All right, welcome everyone to the deep dive. Today we're jumping headfirst into the world of pharmaceutical research and development.
Yeah, we're going to be looking at like the latest trends and insights.
Exactly. And our guide for this journey is the IQVIA Global Trends in Pharma R&D 2025 report.
It's a really impressive report, packed with information.
Really is. It gives us this panoramic view of what's happening in the field right now.
Yeah. It's really fascinating to see how biopharma innovation is constantly pushing forward, even with all the uncertainties in the world, like geopolitical tensions, rapid technological advancements, all that stuff. And the money keeps pouring in.
It's true. It's a really dynamic landscape. So the big question we're tackling today is this. What are the major trends, roadblocks, and opportunities that are shaping the future of, new medicines and how they're developed?
Right. And we're going to be pulling out those key insights, the essential nuggets of knowledge from this really extensive report.
Yeah. We're giving you the shortcuts so you don't have to wade through all the dense material yourself.
Exactly. We'll be focusing on things like, the flow of funding, what's happening with clinical trials, new drug approvals, and the overall efficiency of the R&D process.
Yep. And before we dive in, it's important to highlight that this isn't some industry-sponsored propaganda.
Oh, absolutely not.
This report comes from the IQVIA Institute for Human Data Science, and they did it independently. No strings attached, no industry or government funding involved, just pure objective research. Okay, so let's get into it. Let's talk money, funding, where's it all going?
All right, so the big headline is that R&D spending saw a big jump in 2024. Large pharma companies collectively invested a whopping $190 billion.
Wow, that's a huge increase from, what was it, $163 billion in 2023.
You got it. And what's even more striking is that for the first time ever, their R&D spending as a percentage of sales exceeded 25%.
Okay, so they're really putting their money where their mouth is. It shows a serious commitment to, developing new therapies.
For sure. And if we zoom out and look at the overall biopharma funding landscape, including those smaller emerging companies.
Right, not just the big guys.
Exactly. We saw a huge comeback there, too. Biopharma funding surged back to $102 billion in 2024.
So up from $71 billion a year before, it's a pretty significant rebound.
It is, and looking at the past 5 years, we've seen a total of $486 billion pumped into biopharma R&D. That's compared to just $282 billion in the 5 years before that.
So a clear upward trend. A lot of momentum.
Definitely. And it's interesting to see where this momentum is coming from. Is it a bunch of new companies attracting investment, or are the established players upping their game?
Right, good question. So what's the breakdown?
Well, follow-on funding, basically when companies that already have investors secure additional rounds, that was the biggest driver in 2024. It hit $46 billion, a big leap from $26 billion in 2023.
So investors are doubling down on companies they've already backed. Makes sense.
Yeah, it seems like they're sticking with what they know. IPO values, though, while they're better than 2023, they're still pretty low historically.
It's a little more cautious in that arena.
Yeah. But overall, private and public financing has been pretty consistent. It's stayed above pre-pandemic levels.
Okay, so a mix of confidence and caution makes sense given the uncertainties in the market.
Yeah.
What about mergers and acquisitions? Any big moves in that area?
Oh, absolutely. Some huge M&A deals went down in 2024. Like AbbVie bought Cerevel for $14 billion and then Immunogen for $10 billion.
Wow, that's a lot of billion.
It is. And then there was Novo Holdings buying up Catalent.
That one was big, right? Even though the exact numbers weren't public.
Right, huge. Especially because Novo is really focused on expanding its capacity for producing these GLP-1 receptor agonists. Those are the molecules showing incredible results in treating diabetes and, more recently, in weight management.
Right. The game changers.
Exactly. And then, of course, Gilead acquired CymaBay for $4.3 billion, and AstraZeneca made a bunch of smaller deals totaling $5.8 billion across different areas.
So a lot of strategic moves, bolstering pipelines, grabbing promising technologies. It seems like oncology is a pretty hot target for these big acquisitions, isn't it?
Definitely. Oncology was a major player. But we also saw a lot of action in the gastrointestinal and neurology spaces.
Interesting.
And it's not just, the usual suspects in the Western markets. The report pointed out a growing trend of international deals involving companies based in China.
Oh, really?
Yeah. There were 73 deals in 2024, and a good chunk of those were in oncology, too. It's a sign that biopharma, R&D, and investment are becoming increasingly global.
That's fascinating. It makes sense, though. China's a major player in so many areas now. And what about AI? All the buzz about artificial intelligence and machine learning, is it making waves in the life sciences?
Oh, absolutely. It's not just hype. AI is making a real impact. In 2024, there was almost $10 billion in deals specifically focused on AI and machine learning in the life sciences.
10 billion. That's a staggering amount. It shows real confidence in the potential of AI.
Absolutely. And we saw some really big partnerships too, like Isomorphic Labs teamed up with both Eli Lilly and Novartis.
Wow. And Novartis also partnered with Generate Biomedicines for their protein optimization platform.
Right. And the key areas for AI in these deals are in those early stages of drug development. Things like designing new drug molecules, finding new targets, and the whole drug discovery process.
So using AI to make R&D faster and more efficient.
Exactly. It's all about leveraging the power of AI for those crucial early stages. And finally, in terms of deals and investments, we saw some pretty clear trends in the types of drug modalities that are like attracting the most attention.
What are we talking about here? Small molecules, biologics, all that.
Yeah, all of that. So small molecule drugs, they're still a big deal. Almost half of all deals involve them.
Okay, so they're not going anywhere.
Nope, they're still important.
Yeah.
But, there's also a lot of excitement around newer approaches, like radiopharmaceuticals, which are showing promise in targeted cancer therapies, and RNA therapies, both siRNA and mRNA.
Right. RNA therapies have been kind of exploding in recent years.
More than doubled in deal volume over the past 5 years, actually. And of course, the interest in mRNA vaccines that, really took off during the pandemic, that's still a big factor.
Right. Makes sense. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground on the funding front. It's a complex picture with a lot of moving parts.
For sure. But one thing's clear. There's a lot of money flowing into biopharma R&D.
And it's driving some really interesting trends. Now, let's shift gears and talk about clinical trials. What's happening on the ground, in the labs?
All right, so after some ups and downs in recent years, the number of new clinical trials that started in 2024 kind of stabilized. It landed at 5,318.
Interesting. What's that in comparison to, say, pre-pandemic levels?
It's pretty much on par with what we saw back in 2019 before the world went crazy.
Okay, so things are leveling out a bit.
Yeah. But if you look a little closer, you'll notice a shift in the types of trials being launched. Like there are fewer phase I studies, those early first-in-human trials.
Nice.
But we're seeing an increase in phase 2 and phase 3 trials.
So moving further down the pipeline, that's a good sign, right? More potential for actual drug approvals in the near future.
Exactly. It suggests a pipeline that's, maturing.
Yeah. And who's driving this activity? Are the big pharma companies still in the lead?
Not as much as they used to be. The so-called emerging biopharma companies, or EBPs, they're really stepping up.
Interesting.
They were responsible for a whopping 63% of all new trial starts in 2024. That's up from 56% in 2019.
So a significant increase.
And a good chunk of this growth is coming from companies based in China. Many of them fall into this EBP category.
Right. We're seeing that trend across the board.
Yeah. Meanwhile, Big Pharma's share of trial starts has actually dropped quite a bit. It's now at 26%, which is way down from 47% back in 2015.
Wow, that's a pretty dramatic shift. It seems like those smaller, newer companies are becoming major players in biopharma innovation.
Absolutely. They're shaking things up. Now, in terms of what diseases are being targeted in these trials, oncology is still king.
Not surprising. It seems like it's always at the forefront.
Yeah, oncology was 41% of all trial starts in 2024, up from 38% in 2015. But there are some really interesting shifts happening in other areas, too. Like, there's been a huge surge in trials related to obesity. I mean, a 77% increase in 2024 compared to 2023.
That makes sense. We've seen some incredible breakthroughs in weight loss medications recently.
Exactly. And over the past 5 years, obesity trial starts have increased almost fivefold.
Wow. So a lot of research pouring into that area.
Yeah, it's definitely a hot topic.
Yeah.
Now, on the flip side, there are some areas that are seeing a bit of a slowdown.
Like what?
Well, for example, the report highlighted a decline in trial activity for NASH, which is non-alcoholic steatohepatitis.
Okay. So fewer trials for NASH.
And less involvement from EBP companies in those later stage studies.
Interesting. Any other areas seeing shifts?
Yeah. In neurology trials, there's a trend towards larger companies taking the lead, which probably has a lot to do with those big acquisitions we talked about earlier.
Right. Those big players have the resources for those complex neurology trials.
Exactly. Now, infectious disease trials, those have actually seen an uptick, especially among EBPs in those Chinese companies.
Probably driven by the whole pandemic preparedness thing, right?
Yeah, makes sense. And speaking of important areas of research, what about rare diseases?
All right. Those conditions that often get overlooked. What's the trend there?
Research into rare diseases is definitely on the rise. Trials targeting rare diseases were 45% of all trial starts in 2024.
Wow, 45%. That's a significant chunk.
And within that, oncology is a major focus.
So really honing in on those rarer forms of cancer.
It seems like it. And interestingly, there's actually been a decrease in trials for those more common, larger population oncology indications.
So a shift towards more targeted approaches.
Exactly. Okay, so to sum up the clinical trial landscape, overall starts are stabilizing, EVP companies are on the rise, China is becoming a major force, oncology is still dominant, but with a focus on those rarer forms, obesity trials are exploding, and there are notable shifts in other areas like NARIASH and neurology.
Right. A very dynamic and evolving picture.
Yeah.
So all this research, all this investment, it's ultimately about getting new drugs to patients. What did the report have to say about drug approvals and launches?
Okay, so globally, we saw a slight dip in the number of new active substances, or NAS, launched in 2024. There were 65 compared to 80 in 2023.
So a little bit of a slowdown.
Yeah, but it's worth noting that 2024 was still higher than pre-pandemic levels.
Okay, so still pretty good year overall.
Right. And Japan actually saw an increase in NAS launches in 2024, bucking the global trend a bit.
Interesting. Regional differences at play. What about the U.S. versus Europe? Any discrepancies in getting new drugs to market?
Yeah, the report highlighted that there are more NAS approved in the U.S. that haven't launched in Europe yet compared to the other way around.
So potential lag in Europe.
It seems like it. Could be due to different regulatory timelines or different market access strategies.
Makes sense. And we've heard a lot about China really speeding up its drug approval processes. What's the latest on that?
China has made amazing progress in reducing the time it takes for those globally innovative NAS to hit their market.
That's good news.
The median delay between the first global launch and the launch in China has shrunk dramatically. From 9.6 years back in 2005 to 2009, down to just 3.7 years in 2020 to 2024.
Wow, that's a huge difference. That's really impressive.
And we're also seeing a big jump in the number of NAS that are launching only in China, developed by Chinese companies.
So China's becoming a real powerhouse in its own right.
Exactly. A much more independent player in the global pharmaceutical scene. Now, looking at the U.S. specifically, what types of drugs are being launched there? Are there any trends?
Yeah, what are we seeing?
So the trend in the U.S. is leaning towards biologics, specialty medicines, orphan drugs, and first-in-class medicines.
So really focusing on those more complex and often more expensive therapies.
Yeah, and there's been a big increase in the number of orphan drug designations for drugs that were launched in the U.S. It shows a continued focus on addressing those unmet needs in rare diseases.
Makes sense. And it sounds like 2024 was a big year for first-in-class approvals.
It was. Some really exciting new treatments were approved across a variety of areas like new oncology drugs, new hematology treatments, advancements in neurology, and very importantly, the first gene therapies for sickle cell disease.
Wow, that's a major milestone.
And the first ever approved drug for MASH, which is metabolic dysfunction-associated steatohepatitis.
That's huge, right? Because MASH is a pretty common condition, and there were no treatments before.
Exactly. These approvals are big wins. They represent real progress in treating serious diseases.
Absolutely. Now, what about the timeline from initial discovery to getting a drug to patients? Is that process getting more efficient?
Well, interestingly, the median time for a U.S. NAS launch, like after the initial patent filing or the start of human trials, that actually went up a little bit in 2024.
Oh, really? So things are slowing down.
Well, not necessarily. The vast majority of NAS launches did use those expedited development or regulatory review pathways, like fast track or breakthrough therapy designations.
Right, those programs that speed things up for promising treatments.
Exactly. And we are generally seeing shorter development timelines for certain types of drugs, like biologics, orphan drugs, and specialty medicines.
Makes sense. Those are the areas where there's a real sense of urgency.
Right. So while the overall launch timeline might be edging up slightly, those accelerated pathways are still being heavily utilized, especially for those innovative and urgently needed therapies.
Right, it's about balancing speed and safety. Now, let's talk about how efficient the whole drug development process actually is. The report mentioned this clinical program productivity index. What's that all about?
So the CPPI, or Clinical Program Productivity Index, it's basically a measure of how well investment and effort in clinical development translate into actual successful drug candidates.
Okay, so how efficiently are we turning research into actual medicines?
Exactly. And the good news is the CPPI saw an overall improvement in 2024.
Things are moving in the right direction.
Yeah. And this improvement was mainly driven by higher success rates in phase 3 clinical trials. Those are the large-scale studies that really confirm if a drug works and if it's safe.
Right, the pivotal trials before a drug can be submitted for approval.
Exactly. So more drugs are making it through those crucial phase 3 trials. That's a positive sign for R&D productivity.
It is. Were there any differences in productivity across the different phases of clinical development?
Yeah, actually. While overall productivity improved, we saw a decline in both phase 1 and phase 2 productivity between 2023 and 2024.
Interesting. So the early stages are getting tougher.
It seems like it, but then, as we discussed, phase 3 productivity saw a big jump.
That's a curious divergence.
It is, because historically, success rates in phase 2 and phase 3 have been pretty similar. This shift might suggest that something's changing in how drug candidates are being selected or how trials are being designed.
Right, maybe the criteria are getting stricter or the science is getting more complex.
Could be. And speaking of success, what about the overall likelihood of a whole R&D program making it from the lab to the market?
Right, the whole journey. Is that getting easier or harder?
The composite success rate for R&D programs, it did tick up a bit in 2024, getting back to a level we saw in 2019 to 2022. That improvement in the phase 3 success rate played a big role there.
Right, that makes sense.
But if we look at the long-term trends, there has been a general decline in success rates across most drug modalities, especially for those small molecule drugs.
Okay, so some areas are struggling more than others.
Yeah. And in some therapeutic areas, too, like infectious diseases and respiratory conditions, but there is good news. We've seen an increase in success rates for cell and gene therapy programs.
So the cutting-edge stuff is making headway.
It is, and also for those programs targeting cardiovascular diseases. So it's a mixed bag, really. Some areas are doing well, others are facing challenges.
Right, the complexity of science, right. Now let's talk about the complexity of conducting clinical trials themselves. Are they getting more intricate?
Well, in 2024, the overall complexity of trials was pretty stable. But there were some underlying changes. For instance, we saw an increase in the average number of participants and clinical trial sites involved in each study.
Okay, so more people, more locations. That definitely adds to the logistical challenges.
For sure. But on the other hand, the average number of countries involved in a single trial and the number of those inclusion and exclusion criteria, those actually went down a little.
So a bit of a trade-off.
Right. And the average number of endpoints, like the measures used to determine if a drug is working, that stayed pretty consistent, so it's a balancing act. Different factors pushing and pulling on that overall complexity.
Right, like a tug of war. And geographically, where are most of these trials happening?
We're seeing some pretty big shifts in that regard. China and North America are seeing an increase in their share of trials, while Western and Central Eastern Europe are seeing a decrease.
So the center of gravity is shifting a bit.
It is. And single-country trials are pretty common, especially for those EBP companies. And those single-country trials are most often in either the U.S. or China.
Again, highlighting the growing importance of those two regions.
Absolutely. And lastly, in terms of clinical development productivity, what about those timelines? How long does it take to get through a trial?
Right, that's a crucial question.
It is. And patient enrollment, that's still the biggest bottleneck. It consistently takes the longest time, and it's the most important thing to address if we want to speed up the whole process.
So finding and enrolling enough patients is still the main hurdle.
It is. And unfortunately, median enrollment durations have actually been increasing, especially in oncology trials.
Okay, so that's not good news.
Not ideal. While other things like data management and writing those study reports has gotten a bit quicker, getting those patients enrolled on time is still a major challenge.
I see. Any other interesting insights on timelines?
Yeah, the report pointed out that those initial estimates for how long a trial will take, they're often too optimistic. They tend to underestimate the actual time required.
So things always take longer than you think.
Pretty much. And overall, the total time for a whole R&D program, from that initial research to potential approval, that's increased since 2015, but it has been stabilizing in recent years.
So at least it's not getting any worse.
Right. And those remote or decentralized clinical trials, the ones that were supposed to be game changers for efficiency and patient access.
Right, the ones that got a big boost during the pandemic.
Well, they've kind of returned to pre-pandemic levels.
Oh, really? So they haven't quite lived up to the hype.
It seems like there's still untapped potential there. And finally, on the topic of representation in clinical trials.
Right, making sure those trials reflect the diversity of the patients who will be using the medicines.
That's crucial. And we're seeing some progress, but there's still work to do. Like, Black or African American individuals, they're now included in U.S. Phase 3 trials
Mhm.
at a rate that's higher than their representation in the overall population.
Okay, that's a positive step.
It is, but Hispanic individuals are still underrepresented, so there are still disparities.
Right. A lot more progress needed to ensure truly equitable participation.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground on clinical development productivity. Now let's move on to the last part of the report. The factors that are helping or hindering productivity in R&D. What's driving this complex ecosystem?
Yeah, what's making a difference?
Well, there are a bunch of external factors that are constantly shaping the R&D landscape. Like, think about the crazy advancements in AI, breakthroughs in basic science, the global economic situation, evolving social attitudes, geopolitical events, and changes in government regulations and healthcare policies.
Right, a whole swirling mix of influences.
It's a lot to keep up with. And all of these things create both opportunities and challenges for pharmaceutical companies and the research community in general.
Makes sense. And speaking of AI, we've already talked about the money pouring into it.
Yeah.
But how's it actually being used to boost productivity in R&D?
So the use of AI in pharma R&D is growing fast, and companies that are really focused on AI or machine learning, they're consistently starting new clinical trials. Their technologies are being used mostly in those early stages of research, like identifying promising new drug targets and designing new drug molecules.
So AI is really helping to lay the foundation for new discoveries.
Exactly. It's all about using AI to drive innovation and efficiency in those early stages. And beyond AI, are there any other new approaches to clinical trial design that are helping to speed things up?
Yeah, are there any new tricks up their sleeve?
There are actually. We're seeing more and more use of these novel trial designs, like umbrella trials, basket trials, master protocols, and adaptive designs. These designs offer more flexibility and can potentially evaluate multiple treatments or groups of patients within a single trial.
So getting more bang for your buck, so to speak.
Exactly. And while the use of remote or decentralized trials has leveled off a bit after the pandemic, it's still an important tool.
Right, for improving patient access and potentially making enrollment faster.
Right. Now, we've already touched on the importance of diversity in clinical trials, but it's worth reiterating.
Absolutely. Making sure those trials are inclusive is crucial.
And it's an ongoing challenge. While there's been some progress, like with the increased representation of Black or African American individuals in those U.S. Phase 3 trials, there are still disparities. Like Hispanic populations are still underrepresented.
Right, so there's still a lot of work to be done.
For sure. And the FDA is taking this seriously. They've issued guidance emphasizing diversity, and pharma companies are trying to improve inclusivity with different strategies and action plans.
So it's on everyone's radar.
It is, but it's going to take continued effort and creative solutions to really address those disparities. Now, another interesting trend is the growing use of real-world evidence.
Right, using data from outside those traditional clinical trials.
Exactly. Real-world evidence, or RWE, is becoming more important in regulatory decisions, especially in areas like oncology and rare diseases, where those traditional trial designs can be tricky.
Makes sense. And how is that playing out?
Well, in 2024, there were 5 cases where the FDA relied on real-world evidence to approve new drugs.
So it's becoming a more accepted pathway.
Definitely. And the report also noted a decrease in those complete response letters, or CRLs, from the FDA.
Those are the letters that basically say, nope, not approved.
Right. And this decrease was especially noticeable for those more experienced pharma companies. It could mean that those companies are getting better at submitting those regulatory applications.
Right, learning from experience.
It seems like it. Okay, so last but not least, what's the overall regulatory landscape looking like? How's it affecting R&D productivity?
Yeah, the rules and regulations can make a big difference.
Absolutely. So in 2024, the regulatory environment was fairly stable in most regions. The FDA has been busy issuing guidance on some key areas, like improving diversity in trials, the development of biosimilar drugs, and optimizing drug dosing in oncology with this initiative called Project Optimus.
So the FDA is trying to be proactive and helpful.
Yeah, providing clarity and direction. And we're seeing efforts to harmonize regulations in places like Mexico, and China is increasingly adopting those international guidelines.
So things are moving towards more global consistency.
To some extent. But there are still regional differences. Like in the EU, they're trying to streamline things, but their approval timelines are still longer than in the US.
And what about the UK? Post-Brexit, has anything changed?
Yeah, there have been some new complexities in the UK since Brexit, But overall, pharma companies are using all sorts of strategies to try to speed things up, improve success rates, and manage costs in this evolving regulatory environment.
Right. It's a constant balancing act.
It is. And we're seeing that drugs with shorter development timelines, those often involve compressed trial sequences, or they're single-arm trials in those breakthrough therapy cases.
Right. Where the need is so great that they can bypass some of the usual steps.
Exactly. And also, drugs that incorporate those predictive biomarkers or companion diagnostics, they tend to get through development faster too.
Makes sense? And those expedited review pathways, those are also helping to get drugs approved with fewer patients in the trials. So a win for speed and efficiency.
For sure. And as we've discussed, real-world evidence is being used more and more in FDA approvals.
So a shift towards a more data-driven approach.
Definitely. And on a positive note, most of those CRLs in 2024, those rejections from the FDA, they were for non-clinical reasons. And those more experienced sponsors, they weren't getting as many clinical-related rejections.
So the companies with a good track record are getting it right more often.
It seems like it.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've just gone through a ton of information from this really comprehensive IQVIA report.
We have. It's been a deep dive for sure.
No kidding. But to sum it all up, the biopharma R&D landscape is one of significant and growing investment. We're seeing a stabilization in the number of clinical trials, but with a noticeable shift towards those emerging biopharma companies and a lot more activity in China.
Right. And drug approvals are shifting towards those specialty medicines and treatments for rare diseases.
Exactly. And when it comes to R&D productivity, well, it's complicated. There are some bright spots, but also some persistent challenges.
Right. It's a mixed bag. But I think for me, some of the most striking takeaways were those trends we talked about earlier, like the incredible growth in obesity trials, the massive investments in AI for drug discovery, China's rapid progress in closing that drug launch gap, and the increasing use of real-world evidence for approvals.
Yeah, those are game changers.
They are. And it makes you wonder about the long-term implications, like how will this focus on certain areas affect the types of diseases that are targeted for new treatments? And how quickly will those new treatments get to the patients who need them? Will AI and those innovative trial designs really be able to solve those persistent problems in R&D productivity?
Right. And what role will real-world evidence play in the future of drug development and regulatory approval? These are really important questions to think about.
They are. And they're questions that go way beyond just the pharmaceutical industry. They affect all of us.
Absolutely. So take some time to consider how these global trends might impact your own life, your work, or even just your perspective on healthcare. And if you're really interested in digging deeper, you can find the full IQVIA report, the IQVIA Global Trends in Pharma R&D 2025 report, on their website, iqviainstitute.org.
It's a great resource for staying informed about all the latest developments in pharmaceutical research. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everyone. We'll see you next time.
See you next time.